Yesterday morning, at precisely 10 a.m. Moscow time and 3 p.m. Beijing time, two governments issued simultaneous statements from their respective foreign ministries. Russia and China, in a coordinated diplomatic maneuver unprecedented in scope, announced a comprehensive peace framework designed to end the military conflict between the United States and Iran. The announcement was not a suggestion. It was a formal proposal submitted to the United Nations Security Council, backed by the two most powerful adversaries of American global influence, and structured in a way that left Washington with limited options. The document, titled Framework for Comprehensive Resolution of the Persian Gulf Crisis, consisted of 12 specific provisions. It was presented as a balanced approach to ending hostilities, restoring regional stability, and addressing the legitimate security concerns of all parties. But a close reading revealed a different structure. Nearly every provision required the United States to make concessions that Iran had been demanding since the conflict began, and the verification mechanisms, the enforcement procedures, and the timeline for implementation all placed Russia and China in positions of authority over the process. This was not mediation. It was strategic positioning disguised as peacemaking. The first provision called for an immediate 72-hour ceasefire, followed by permanent cessation of hostilities contingent on implementation of the remaining terms. This was standard diplomatic language and raised no objections. The second provision, however, specified that U.S. military forces would withdraw from the Persian Gulf region within 6 months, not redeploy to safer positions, not reduce presence proportionally with Iranian de-escalation. Complete withdrawal. Every base, every ship, every aircraft that had been positioned in the region as part of operations against Iran would be removed. The third provision mandated the immediate lifting of all economic sanctions on Iran, not gradual removal tied to Iranian compliance with nuclear or missile restrictions. Immediate and complete sanctions relief, including restoration of access to international banking systems, removal from terrorism watch lists, and unfreezing of billions in Iranian assets held in foreign accounts. The fourth provision guaranteed Iran's right to sell oil on international markets without restriction. The fifth allowed Iran to continue its nuclear program for peaceful energy purposes, subject to monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency but with no specific limits on enrichment levels or stockpile quantities. The sixth addressed Iran's ballistic missile program, calling for reasonable limits consistent with legitimate defense needs. The language was deliberately vague, leaving interpretation to a future negotiation process where Russia and China would have significant influence. Provision 7 established international oversight of the Strait of Hormuz to ensure freedom of navigation. But the oversight mechanism would be a multinational body including Russia, China, Iran, and Gulf Cooperation Council states. The United States would participate but would not have veto authority or enforcement power. Russia and China as co-chairs would have final say on disputed issues. The eighth provision created a reconstruction fund to rebuild Iranian infrastructure damaged during the conflict. Contributions would be solicited from the international community, but administration of the fund would be managed by a committee led by Russia, China, and Iran. The United States would be expected to contribute financially but would have minimal say in how funds were allocated. Provision 9 mandated a complete prisoner exchange. All detained personnel from both sides would be released simultaneously. This was one of the few provisions with genuine symmetry, though it also ensured that Iran would recover intelligence officers and military personnel held by the U.S. without conditions. The 10th provision established a regional security forum bringing together the United States, Iran, Russia, China, and Gulf states to address broader Middle East stability. This formalized a multilateral structure where U.S. influence would be diluted by the presence of adversaries with competing interests. Provision 11 explicitly ruled out any external interference in Iran's internal governance. The phrase regime change was not used, but the intent was clear. The United States would commit to accepting the current Iranian government as legitimate and permanent. The 12th and final provision designated Russia and China as co-chairs of the verification and implementation process. They would monitor compliance, adjudicate disputes, and determine whether parties were meeting their obligations. The United States would report to a committee led by the very nations that had been arming and supporting Iran throughout the conflict. The pattern was unmistakable. The United States would withdraw forces, lift sanctions, provide reconstruction funds, and accept limits on its regional presence. Iran would agree to vague and unenforceable restrictions on its nuclear and missile programs, continue selling oil, and retain its current government and military structure. Russia and China would oversee everything, ensuring that interpretations favored outcomes aligned with their strategic interests. The proposal was brilliant in its construction. It could not be dismissed outright as unreasonable. Every provision had a diplomatic justification. Ceasefire and withdrawal were framed as necessary steps to end violence. Sanctions relief was presented as humanitarian concern for the Iranian population suffering economic hardship. The Regional Security Forum sounded like multilateral cooperation. But the cumulative effect was a framework that ratified Iranian gains, minimized American leverage, and positioned Russia and China as the arbiters of Middle East stability. Washington's response was cautious. The initial statement from the State Department acknowledged receipt of the proposal and indicated that it was under review. No rejection, no endorsement, just a commitment to study the document and consult with allies. But behind closed doors, the debate was intense. One faction argued for outright rejection. The framework was designed to humiliate the United States and hand Iran a strategic victory. Accepting it would signal that American military power could be negated by prolonged conflict and coordinated diplomatic pressure from adversaries. It would embolden Russia and China to pursue similar strategies in other regions. And it would undermine confidence among U.S. allies who depended on American security commitments. Another faction argued for engagement. The war was not going well. Casualties were mounting. Costs were unsustainable. Public support had collapsed. The alternative to accepting some version of this framework was continued conflict with no clear path to victory. If the United States rejected the proposal outright, it would be blamed for prolonging the war and rejecting a reasonable peace offer. That narrative would dominate international discourse and further erode American credibility. A third faction advocated for a counter-proposal. Accept the concept of a negotiated framework but insist on modifications that addressed U.S. concerns. Troop withdrawal could be conditional on verified Iranian compliance. Sanctions relief could be phased over time rather than immediate. Verification could include American representatives with equal authority to Russian and Chinese co-chairs. The challenge was that Iran, backed by Russia and China, would have no incentive to accept a revised framework that removed the advantages built into the original. Iran's response was immediate and positive. The supreme leader issued a statement calling the proposal a constructive pathway to peace and expressing willingness to engage in good faith negotiations based on the framework. Iranian state media framed the plan as international recognition that Iran's position was justified and that American aggression had been rejected by the global community. European reactions were mixed. France and Germany issued cautious statements acknowledging the proposal as a serious diplomatic effort but emphasizing the need for careful review and consultation with all stakeholders. Neither endorsed the framework but neither rejected it. The United Kingdom aligned more closely with the United States, expressing concerns about provisions that appeared to favor Iran disproportionately. But even British officials acknowledged that some elements of the proposal merited consideration. Regional allies were alarmed. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf Cooperation Council states recognized that a U.S. withdrawal from the region would leave them exposed to Iranian influence and pressure. They conveyed urgent messages to Washington urging rejection of any plan that removed American military presence. But those same governments were also suffering economically from the conflict. Oil prices, shipping disruptions, and the constant threat of missile attacks were damaging their economies. They wanted the war to end, but not on terms that left Iran in a dominant position. Israel's reaction was categorical. Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly opposed the framework, calling it a capitulation to Iranian demands that would leave the regime emboldened and capable of pursuing nuclear weapons and regional hegemony. Israeli intelligence agencies provided detailed briefings to U.S. counterparts, highlighting the weaknesses in verification provisions and the likelihood that Iran would exploit ambiguities to advance prohibited programs. Russia and China, having launched the proposal, now applied diplomatic pressure for acceptance. Both governments issued statements emphasizing the urgency of ending the conflict and the responsibility of all parties to engage constructively with the peace framework. They coordinated messaging at the United Nations, in bilateral meetings with other nations, and through state media outlets. The narrative they promoted was consistent. The international community had provided a reasonable path to peace, and any party that rejected it would bear responsibility for continued violence. The Security Council vote was scheduled for 30 days after the proposal's submission. That deadline created time pressure. The United States could delay, but it could not avoid a decision indefinitely. A veto would be politically damaging, confirming the narrative that Washington preferred war to compromise. Abstaining would be interpreted as weakness. Supporting the resolution would mean accepting a framework heavily weighted against American interests. There was no good option. Domestic political pressures compounded the dilemma. Progressive members of Congress called for acceptance of the peace framework. arguing that continued war served no vital American interest and imposed unacceptable costs on military families and the economy. Conservative members condemned the proposal as appeasement and demanded that the administration reject any plan that allowed Iran to continue nuclear enrichment and missile development. The president, facing midterm elections in 3 months, was caught between constituencies that could not be simultaneously satisfied. The Pentagon developed an alternative proposal. It maintained the concept of a negotiated settlement but included stricter verification mechanisms, conditional sanctions relief tied to verified Iranian compliance, and a phased withdrawal of U.S. forces dependent on measurable improvements in regional security. The plan was technically superior in addressing American concerns, but it had a fatal flaw. Iran had no reason to accept it. The Russia-China framework gave Iran nearly everything it wanted. A U.S. counterproposal that removed those advantages would simply be rejected, and Russia and China would support Iran's rejection. International legal experts debated whether the framework violated principles of sovereignty or represented legitimate conflict resolution. Some argued that provisions requiring U.S. withdrawal and limiting American regional presence infringed on the rights of sovereign nations to determine their own security arrangements. Others contended that the proposal merely asked the United States to accept the same constraints on military presence that it sought to impose on Iran. The clock ran down. 29 days after the proposal was submitted, the United States had still not issued a definitive response. Diplomatic channels were active. Consultations continued, but no decision had been announced. The Security Council vote would proceed regardless. Russia and China had the votes to pass the resolution unless the United States exercised its veto, and that veto would come with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate question of Iran. On the morning of Day 30, the American ambassador to the United Nations received instructions. The decision had been made. The United States would neither support nor veto the resolution. It would abstain. The explanation provided to the media was that the framework contained elements worthy of consideration, but also provisions that required further negotiation. Abstaining allowed the process to move forward without American endorsement or obstruction. The resolution passed. Russia, China, and 12 other Security Council members voted in favor. The United States and the United Kingdom abstained. The framework became the official United Nations position on resolving the conflict. It was not legally binding on the parties, but it established the diplomatic baseline. Any future negotiations would reference this document. Any alternative proposals would be compared to its terms. Russia and China had successfully positioned their preferred outcome as the international consensus. Iran declared victory. The framework validated its demands and positioned it favorably for whatever negotiations followed. The United States had not achieved its objectives and now faced a choice between accepting a disadvantageous peace or continuing a war that was increasingly unsustainable. Russia and China had demonstrated their ability to coordinate diplomatic pressure and shape international responses to conflicts involving American forces. And the world had witnessed a new pattern. Adversaries could constrain American military power not by matching it directly, but by imposing costs, sustaining pressure, and offering frameworks for resolution that advanced their interests while appearing reasonable to international audiences. The war had not ended, but the terms of its ending had been written, and they had been written in Moscow and Beijing, not Washington.